We've all had those days where the universe seems to have a personal vendetta against us. You know the ones. You spill coffee on your white shirt, and you miss the train by 3 seconds, and then it starts to rain. And you don't have an umbrella. It's frustrating, sure. But usually, by the time you're tucked into bed with a snack, the world has finished its little tantrum. Now, imagine that instead of a spilled latte, the universe was throwing literal explosives at your head. And imagine that instead of it happening once, it happened over and over for nearly 2 decades. At some point, you'd stop being scared and just start being annoyed. Welcome to the Vault. Before we begin, understand that history is rarely a straight line. It's often a jagged edge of impossible coincidence and narrow escapes. In the heart of the 19th century, one man sat upon a throne that seemed to be carved from pure misfortune. King Louis-Philippe of France wasn't just a monarch. He was a walking statistical impossibility. While most leaders fear a single shadow in a dark alley, this man lived through a series of distinct, organized attempts to end his journey. He became a living anomaly, a man who stared into the eyes of the end so many times that he eventually started to treat his own potential demise like a minor administrative error. Louis-Philippe I was not your typical royal. He was known as the Citizen King, a man who preferred a simple umbrella to a scepter and walked the streets of Paris like a commoner. Perhaps that was his first mistake. Most kings stay behind thick stone walls and iron gates, but Louis-Philippe liked to mingle. It was the 19th century equivalent of a celebrity who insists on going grocery shopping without a bodyguard. It's a charming sentiment, until you realize that half of France is currently in a very bad mood and looking for someone to blame. The year was 1835. The air in Paris was thick with the smell of horse manure and political unrest. It was the anniversary of the July Revolution, and the king was scheduled to lead a grand parade. Now, a sensible person would have looked at the intelligence reports and decided to stay home with a good book. But Louis-Philippe had a point to prove. He rode out on his horse, flanked by his sons and a gaggle of high-ranking officials. He was a perfect moving target. Enter Giuseppe. Giuseppe was a man with a very specific set of skills and even more specific lack of morals. He wasn't interested in a simple handheld pew-pew. No, Giuseppe wanted something cinematic. He rented a room on the 3rd floor of a house overlooking the Boulevard du Temple. My French accent's terrible, by the way. And spent months building what he called the Infernal Machine. Imagine a heavy wooden frame propped up like a morbid easel. On this frame, Giuseppe mounted 25 separate long-range barrels. He rigged them all to a single fuse so that when he pulled the trigger, all 25 barrels would discharge simultaneously. It was essentially a wall of lead. It was a 19th century claymore aimed directly at the king's chest. As the royal procession approached, Giuseppe lit the fuse. The explosion was so violent, it didn't just fire projectiles. It disintegrated parts of the building. The sound was a physical blow that knocked people to their knees blocks away. Smoke, thick and gray, choked the street. When it cleared, the scene was a nightmare. 18 people laid stationary in the gutter. A marshal of France had been hit, and a 14-year-old girl who had just come to see the horses was gone. The king's horse was leaking crimson life fluid. The king's carriage was riddled with holes. But wait. As the survivors scrambled for cover and the screams began to echo off the cobblestones, a figure emerged from the smoke. Louis-Philippe was still on his horse. He wasn't clutching his chest. He wasn't gasping for air. He had a small red scratch on his forehead where a piece of debris had grazed him. But that was it. He stood there, covered in the dust of 18 fallen subjects, and simply straightened his hat. He didn't flee for the palace. He didn't call for a doctor. He looked at the wreckage, signaled his remaining guards, and finished the parade. He finished the review of the troops while the pavement was still slick and stained behind him. It was a display of either incredible bravery or complete lack of survival instinct. I'm not sure which. But this was only the beginning. You see, after the Giuseppe incident, the floodgates opened. It was as if the Unkillable king had issued a challenge to every disgruntled extremist in Europe. If a 25-barrel superweapon couldn't do it, what would? A few years later, a man named Alibod decided to try a more personal touch. He waited for the king's carriage to pass through a gate and aimed his pew-pew at point-blank range. We aren't talking about a sniper shot from a roof. We're talking about a distance where you could smell the shooter's breakfast. The projectile whistled past the king's ear, missing him by less than an inch. Louis-Philippe's reaction? He leaned out of the carriage window to see if the horses were okay. He treated the attempt like a bothersome fly. Then there was the case of Monarch in 1836. This one is almost slapstick, if it weren't so morbid. Monarch waited until the king was leaning out of his carriage window to acknowledge the crowd. He fired his pew-pew, and the projectile actually struck the glass of the window just as the king was pulling his head back inside. The glass shattered into a million diamond-like shards, showering the king's face and chest. Any one of those shards could have blinded him or nicked a major artery in his neck. Instead, the king just brushed the glass off his coat like he was dusting off breadcrumbs. He looked at the shattered window, he looked at the would-be assassin being tackled by police, and reportedly sighed because the draft in the carriage was now going to be dreadfully inconvenient. Imagine being the glassmaker tasked with repairing that carriage. You'd probably start charging a danger premium just for touching the king's property. The palace staff began to treat these events with a dry, exhausted professionalism. There was a protocol for everything: the crimson fluid cleanup, the replacement of the velvet cushions, the interrogation of the men who thought they could change history with a single spark. In 1840, another man decided that the previous assassins failed because they didn't use enough oomph. He was a floor scrubber by trade, which perhaps explains why he thought he could just scrub the king from existence. He loaded an oversized carbine with so much powder and so many projectiles that the weapon was essentially a handheld bomb. He wanted to make sure that even if he missed the heart, the sheer force of the blast would do the job. When the king's carriage rolled past, he pulled the trigger, and the universe stepped in with a deadpan punchline. The gun exploded. Not the cartridge, not the king, the gun. The weapon burst into jagged fragments in the assassin's hand. While the assassin was busy trying to remember where he'd last seen his fingers, Louis-Philippe was already half a mile down the road. It was as if the weapons themselves were on the royal payroll, refusing to function out of sheer loyalty, or perhaps they were just as tired of the drama as everyone else was. But the absurdity reached its peak with the attempt of a man named Lecomte in 1846. Lecomte was a former forest ranger. This wasn't a political statement, it was a workplace grievance. He felt the king owed him a pension, and since the HR department was being slow, he decided to take his complaints directly to the top. He hid in a tree, literally a tree, on the grounds of the palace of Fontainebleau. He spent hours in the branches waiting for the royal carriage to pass by. Now, Lecomte was a trained marksman. He spent his life hitting moving targets in the dense woods of France. He knew how to account for wind, for speed, for the rustle of the leaves. But when it came to Louis-Philippe, his skill seemed to simply evaporate into the forest air. He fired twice. The projectile passed through the open carriage, missing the king, the queen, and the row of children by mere centimeters. They embedded themselves in the expensive wood of their seats, leaving behind nothing but the smell of burnt powder and the very confused forest ranger. The king's response? He didn't even stop the carriage. He told the driver to keep going because he didn't want to be late for dinner. Imagine being the assassin in that tree, watching the man you just shot at simply drive away like you were a minor traffic delay. It's the ultimate insult to a professional, being ignored by your target. Statistics tell us that if you stand in front of enough loaded hardware, eventually one of them is going to work. But the forensic soot of these cases suggests something stranger. In another instant, an assassin had his finger on the trigger, the king in his sights and a clear path to his target. But at the exact moment he squeezed, a bystander accidentally bumped his elbow. The shot went wide, hitting the stone wall. In another, the powder in the pan was damp from the Parisian humidity and refused to spark. It wasn't just luck, it was as if the universe was playing a very dark game of keep-away with the king's blood. By the mid-1840s, the assassin's fatigue had reached its peak. The court of Louis-Philippe was a strange place to work. He'd be sitting down for a formal dinner and someone would mention that another man had just been caught in the gardens with a sharpened edge. The response wasn't shock, it was usually a request for more wine. The paranoia had become a lifestyle. The king's sons began to joke about who would have to take over if the unkillable finally proved to be killable. The point of no return for the public's perception of the king came during the attempt by Henry later that same year. Henry fired twice into the royal transport while the family was vacationing. Once again, the projectiles passed through the carriage, missing everyone. At this point, the French public stopped being horrified and started being suspicious. People began to whisper in cafes. They joked that the king was wearing a suit of invisible armor made of pure, truthish luck. Some even suggested he was staging these himself to gain sympathy. After all, if you can't get the people to love you, maybe you can get them to feel sorry for you. But then they looked at the wreckage. They looked at the shattered remains of the Infernal Machine and the 18 people who were permanently stopped by it. No one else staged a fake event by blowing up nearly 20 people. This was real. The danger was palpable, and the king's survival was becoming a theological problem for the church and a mathematical nightmare for the scientists. The king's psychological state during this time was equally strange. He began to treat his life like a ledger. Every failed attempt was just another entry in the "not today" column. He famously said, "I am the only man in France who can't get decent life insurance policy because the underwriters think I'm a ghost." He wasn't wrong. By the time the 10th, 11th, and 12th plots were uncovered, the sense of inevitability had vanished. People began to believe that Louis-Philippe would simply live forever, purely out of spite. The visceral part of this history isn't the medal, it's the toll it took on the palace staff. Your job is to keep the king's boots polished, but your unofficial job description includes potentially being vaporized by a radical device. The palace became a fortress of paranoia. The walls were checked for secret compartments every hour. Every gift sent to the palace, every crate of wine, every fine silk ribbon, was treated like a ticking device. The food was tasted by men who probably had the highest life insurance premiums in Europe. Yet the king remained oddly detached. He seemed to understand that his life was no longer in his own hands. He became a ghost of his own life, a man who had survived so many final moments that the concept of an ending started to feel like a myth. He walked through the clouds of smoke and crimson spray like he was walking through a light rain. There was a time a man tried to jump into his carriage with a dagger, only to trip on his own cloak and be sat upon by a guard. There was a time a man tried to poison the royal wine, only for the king to decide that very night to go on a royal health kick and drink nothing but water. It wasn't just that the assassins were bad, it was that the king's timing was perfect, even when he wasn't trying. By the 14th attempt, the assassins weren't even seen as villains anymore. They were seen as losers. The newspapers began to treat the attempts with a dry, understated mockery. Another day, another failed plot, they would write. The king himself reportedly stopped looking over his shoulder. Why bother? If a 25-barrel superweapon couldn't do it, what chance did a lone man with a rusty blade have? He had reached a state of Zen-like indifference with his own mortality. But as we look back into the files of the vault, we realize that sometimes the most dangerous place for a royal isn't in front of an assassin's barrel. Sometimes the universe saves the strange endings for behind closed doors, where the threat isn't a radical, but a relative. And so you don't miss any of our videos in the vault, go ahead and like and subscribe. Which brings us to the next file, the Tower of London wine barrel execution. Why did King Henry IV drown his own royal brother? You see, while Louis-Philippe was dodging projectiles in the streets, others were finding out that family time could be much more hazardous to your health. Because after 14 attempts on his life, the unkillable king finally met his match. But it wasn't a gun that took the citizen king. It was the one thing no amount of luck could outrun. In 1848, another revolution, this one made of angry mobs rather than lone snipers, finally forced him to flee. He didn't leave in a blaze of glory. He fled to France's oldest rival, England, disguised as a commoner named Mr. Smith. He wore a pair of plain spectacles and a borrowed coat, looking more like a retired accountant than a man who had survived 14 brushes with the Reaper. He didn't fall in a grand battle or by a jagged blade. He spent his final 2 years in a quiet house in Surrey, watching the English reign and probably enjoying the fact that nobody was trying to blow him up. He lived a life of quiet, boring peace, a luxury he had been denied for 18 years. The man who survived the 25 barrels of lead and 14 separate plots to end his journey was eventually undone by a simple, staggering irony. In August of 1850, his lungs simply gave up. The unkillable king died in a soft bed of a common respiratory failure. He had outrun 14 assassins, only to be caught by the cold English air. It turns out even the most legendary luck eventually runs out of breath. He survived the Infernal Machine, only to be taken down by a draft under the door. This is Truthish, where things are mostly true and always strange. Thanks for watching.